In the deep shadows of America's slaveholding South, whispers spread faster than the crack of any overseer's whip. Whispers about a boy no older than 15, a boy unlike any enslaved person anyone had ever seen. His name was Ezekiel, but most never dared say it out loud. They called him Blue Eye because beneath his dark lashes one eye burned a shocking ice blue, a color that seemed to see straight through a person's soul. He didn't talk much, he didn't fight back, yet every master who bought him, every overseer who tried to break him, lasted no more than a week before sending him away in terror. Some said he was cursed, others believed he could predict death. A few swore they saw things around him, shadows that moved when he stood still, animals that refused to go near him, and coincidences so impossible they felt like warnings from something far beyond human. And as the stories grew, so did the fear. Plantations that had never agreed on anything suddenly had one rule in common: never keep the blue-eyed slave longer than 7 days. But what happened during those 7 days? Why did hardened men, cruel overseers and experienced slaveholders tremble in his presence? And what truth hid behind that single blue-eye birthright curse, or something far more dangerous? This is the chilling mystery of the slave with one blue eye, the boy every master feared after just 1 week. The first time Ezekiel arrived on a plantation, no one noticed anything unusual except the quiet way he walked, his shoulders drawn in just enough to look obedient, but not enough to look broken. He was small for 15, thin, almost fragile-looking, the kind of boy an overseer would normally assume could be bent to any task with a little pressure. But when the master stepped closer and the sunlight struck his face just right, revealing that single impossibly cold blue eye where a brown one should have been, every assumption evaporated. It was as if the boy carried winter inside himself, as if something about him did not belong to the sweltering southern heat or the cruelty that fed upon it. The master stiffened, just for a second, but it was enough for the overseers to glance at one another, eyebrows raised, a silent exchange none of them acknowledged out loud. The traders had warned the master that the boy came cheap, because none of the larger plantations wanted him anymore. They hadn't said why. Slave auctions were filled with superstitions, marks on skin, strange scars, old injuries. None of that mattered much because work was work, and bodies were bodies. But one trader, a man with tobacco-stained teeth and a tremor in his hands, had whispered that the boy had a look in him, some kind of presence that turned the bravest dogs skittish, and made hired men feel watched even when the boy stood with his head bowed. The master didn't believe in that kind of nonsense. Not really, but the price had been low, and cheap labor was cheap labor. Still, when he caught sight of that blue eye, something knotted in his stomach before he pushed the feeling down, blaming it on fatigue, heat, anything except the boy himself. The enslaved workers noticed immediately. They weren't allowed to look directly at new arrivals for long, but they saw enough in quick glances, just enough to stiffen their backs and murmur prayers under their breath when the overseers weren't listening. To them, that eye was not merely a trait but a sign, a warning carved into flesh. Some whispered the boy had been born under a cursed moon. Others said he'd survived something no child should survive, something that left a mark on his spirit rather than his body. A few older women who carried stories older than America itself exchanged looks that said more than words ever could, but none dared speak to him on that first day, not until they knew what kind of presence he carried into their already dangerous world. The animals were the second to react. Horses pulled back in their stalls, snorting and stamping when he passed. Dogs that normally lunged at new slaves with vicious excitement slunk away instead, whining low in their throats, ears pinned flat. One dog even tried to bite him once out of fear rather than aggression, but the moment Ezekiel turned his head, the dog froze mid-snarl, trembled and backed away as if it had seen something standing behind the boy rather than the boy himself. The overseers took note, muttering that the animals must have caught the scent of sickness or weakness, but they watched him more closely after that, though none admitted it. On his first night in the slave quarters, Ezekiel didn't speak. He sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the dusty floor as if he expected it to move or sink, or reveal something beneath the boards. No one approached him. Even the bravest among the enslaved men stayed back, pretending not to look while keeping him within the corner of their vision. There was something unsettling in how still he was, how quiet, how the shadows around him seemed slightly longer than the ones cast by everyone else. One woman tried to offer him a piece of cornbread, but when he lifted his eyes to her, she flinched, dropped the food and hurried away without taking a breath. It wasn't fear of him, it was fear of what she felt staring back through that one eye. The next morning, work began before sunrise. Ezekiel was put in the fields with the others, handed a worn hoe, and expected to fall into rhythm. No one thought he'd last more than a day. He looked too thin, too fragile, too distant. But as the sun rose and scorched the horizon, he moved with steady precision, keeping pace with men twice his size. He didn't complain when the overseer barked orders. He didn't wince when the whip cracked near him. A warning. He didn't even look tired. It was as if the heat didn't touch him, as if the hours didn't press down on him the way they pressed on everyone else. The other enslaved workers watched in wary silence, wondering what kind of strength lay inside such a small frame, a strength that did not feel entirely natural. The overseers grew uneasy. They couldn't explain why. They were men hardened by years of cruelty, men who had seen broken bones and broken spirits, who knew how to read fear and rebellion in the flick of an eye or the stiffness of a spine. But Ezekiel gave them nothing to read. He obeyed without hesitation, but not out of fear. He worked without complaint, but not out of submission. It was as if he existed slightly out of sync with everyone around him, following orders in the same way a shadow follows a body, automatically, without emotion, without investment. One overseer tried to intimidate him by shoving him hard between the shoulder blades, expecting a stumble or a cry, but the boy merely shifted his weight, regained balance, and continued working as though the push had been nothing more than a passing breeze. The overseer stepped back, unsettled by the absence of reaction, the absence of anything at all. News spread quietly among the enslaved people from nearby plantations. Workers who traveled between farms carried whispers about the blue-eyed boy who didn't speak, who didn't tire, who made dogs panic and overseers sweat under their collars. Some said he had seen visions of death. Some claimed he had survived a house fire where everyone else perished. Others believed he was touched by something unearthly, something neither benevolent nor malevolent, something simply beyond human understanding. And every rumor, no matter how wild, seemed to grow heavier the more days passed. By the third day, even the master avoided looking him in the eye. By the fourth, the overseers stopped giving him direct orders unless necessary, sending instructions through other slaves instead. By the fifth, the nightly sounds of the plantation frogs, crickets, horses shifting in their stalls grew strangely quiet whenever he walked past. By the sixth, the air itself seemed to change around him, tense in a way that made sleep difficult and conversation brief. And by the seventh day, the master, pale and trembling for reasons he refused to name, had already decided he would not keep Ezekiel a moment longer, no matter the cost, no matter the loss, no matter what the traders whispered about the boy being passed from plantation to plantation as if he carried an unseen storm with him, waiting for the right place to finally break. The first 7 days on any plantation he entered became a countdown, a quiet ticking menace that no one could explain but everyone felt. The moment Ezekiel stepped onto new soil, the air seemed to change, as if the land itself recognized him before the people did. Those first hours were always the calmest, a thin, deceptive calm that fooled masters into believing the rumors were exaggerations, nothing more than the usual superstitions that followed any unusual slave. They would watch him from a distance, noting his small frame, the stillness in his movements, the humble way he kept his head down, and they would convince themselves that the stories were nothing but nonsense. But by the end of the first night something always happened, something small, something easy to dismiss, yet enough to unsettle even the most skeptical man. It might begin with the animal. Horses that had eaten well for years would suddenly refuse their feed, pacing in their stalls as if something outside stalked them. Dogs that normally barked at every rustle would fall strangely silent, lying flat against the ground with their ears pinned back, eyes flicking toward the slave quarters whenever the wind shifted. Chickens would flap wildly for no reason, scattering feathers across the yard as if chased by invisible hands. None of these things were alarming on their own, but when they happened together within hours of the boy's arrival, even the most hardened overseers felt a faint tightening at the back of their necks, a feeling they chose not to speak aloud. By the second night, small accidents crept into the routine of the plantation. A stable door that had been locked at sunset would be found standing wide open at dawn, though no thief had touched a single item inside. Tools left hanging neatly for years would be discovered scattered across the dirt in unusual patterns, never random, almost purposeful. Lanterns would flicker violently for seconds at a time, even when no wind blew. Most of these moments were witnessed only by the enslaved workers who rose early or went to sleep late, and they whispered to each other in hushed tones, warning the new boy to sleep lightly, though he rarely seemed to sleep at all. In the dim glow of moonlight he could sometimes be seen sitting upright, staring at the far wall as if listening to something the others couldn't hear. On the third day the accidents grew sharper. An overseer who had gotten too close to Ezekiel would trip over nothing and fall face first into the dirt, breaking his nose. Another would find his whip missing from his belt, only to discover it later neatly coiled atop the roof of the smokehouse where no one could have reached without a ladder. Wagons rolled slightly downhill even when the wheels were locked. Doors slammed in empty hallways. The master would lie awake at night, listening to footsteps he couldn't place, pacing back and forth as though someone wandered the house even though all servants were accounted for. Nothing was ever violent, Nothing ever openly threatening, but the unease grew thicker each hour, pressing down on everyone like a warning too subtle to understand but too heavy to ignore. By the fourth day, the overseers began avoiding the boy without admitting it. They assigned him work at the edge of the fields, far from the main house, claiming they wanted to test his strength. But in truth, they simply didn't want him close. They started sending commands through other slaves instead of approaching him directly. One overseer, a man known for beating workers without reason, tried to pretend he wasn't afraid, but even he flinched when Ezekiel turned his head, allowing that single blue eye to reflect the afternoon sun like a shard of cold glass. The overseer swore the boy's gaze made his skin prickle as if watched by something far older than a child, and that night he woke trembling, convinced he had heard whispering outside his window though no one was there. By the fifth day, the rumors arrived, carried from plantation to plantation by enslaved workers who passed messages more efficiently than any postal line. They spoke of Ezekiel as if he were both human and not, as if he carried a presence that acted without him, a force that followed him like a silent guardian, or perhaps a shadow of something terrible that once touched him. Workers whispered of strange chills that passed through the fields even on the hottest mornings. They spoke of birds that avoided landing near him. They passed along stories from other plantations. A haystack that caught fire without cause, a mule that died of fright after staring too long at the boy, a master who packed up and moved Ezekiel out in the middle of the night after waking to find every candle in his house burning at once without having been lit. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated mattered little. They wrapped around Ezekiel like a cloak, and fear grew in the spaces where facts blurred into myth. On the sixth day, the atmosphere shifted from uneasy to oppressive. Everyone felt its slaves, overseers, even the master himself. The sky appeared overcast even when no clouds were present, as though a thin veil dulled the sunlight. The workers began working faster, anxious to finish before something happened. Though no one could say what they feared, the master tried to reassure himself that nothing truly dangerous had occurred, that his imagination was making small inconveniences seem large. But his hands shook slightly when he poured his morning coffee, and his wife refused to leave the house after claiming she heard footsteps behind her when she walked through the yard alone. It wasn't always the same on every plantation, but the feeling was always identical: anticipation, dread, tension winding tighter with each passing hour. Something was building, something was approaching, something would happen before the seventh day ended, and every soul on the property felt it deep in their bones. The seventh day was always the worst. Before dawn, a stillness would settle across the land, the kind of stillness that comes before a violent storm, yet no storm clouds ever form. The enslaved people would rise earlier than usual, wanting nothing more than to be far from the boy, far from the fields, far from anything that might draw the attention of whatever force lingered near him. Animals refused to leave their shelters, trembling so violently they seemed ready to collapse. Even the wind avoided the plantation, leaving the air thick and unmoving, heavy as though pressed down by unseen hands. Something always happened on that seventh day, something impossible to deny, impossible to explain. On one plantation, all the water in the well turned cloudy for hours before clearing again. On another, the master's prized horse collapsed without injury or illness, as though its heart simply gave up. On yet another, a room in the big house flooded with freezing water, though no pipe had burst, no rain had fallen, and the door had been locked all night. The event was never the same, never repeated from place to place, and yet every master recognized it for what it was: a final warning, a line drawn in the sand, a message that keeping the boy any longer was a mistake of catastrophic proportion. By the end of that seventh night, every master made the same decision. Fear outweighed profit, superstition outweighed logic, and Ezekiel was removed from the property with shaking hands and hurried orders. No one argued, no one hesitated. By dawn, he would be gone, carried to yet another plantation where the cycle would begin again, where 7 days would pass like a slow tightening noose, drawing fear out of the shadows and wrapping it around the hearts of those who dared believe that one boy with one unnatural blue eye was just a child and nothing more. Across the South, his name traveled farther than any runaway notice, whispered from field to field, cabin to cabin, until even those who had never seen him felt they had. Rumors wrapped around his story like vines, twisting, growing, changing shape with each tell. To some he was Ezekiel, a quiet enslaved boy with one blue eye. To others he was simply the omen, a child touched by something unearthly, carrying signs that made grown men tremble. And though no two accounts fully matched, every story held the same core wherever he stayed. Fear followed, and after 7 days no master dared keep him. That fear grew into legend, a legend that fed on itself, becoming larger, darker, more impossible to contain. The enslaved community, always forced to survive between silence and resistance, listened closely to the stories. They were the first to shape the myth, not out of cruelty or fascination, but out of necessity. When suffering becomes routine, people cling to the extraordinary,
to signs and symbols that challenge the power of the men who claim ownership over bodies and futures. Ezekiel became one such symbol. He moved quietly, never asking for belief, never offering explanations, but the workers around him filled the silence with meaning. They spoke of the way shadows bent around him, of how the air cooled when he passed, of how his footsteps barely disturbed the dust. To many he was not cursed, he was chosen to disturb the peace of those who believed they owned the world, chosen to be a reminder that no man's rule is absolute, chosen to be the tremor beneath the surface of their oppression. Older slaves remembered stories their parents and grandparents had whispered on ships and in coastal huts, far from America, stories of spirits that walked with the living, guardians that clung to children born under unusual signs, ancestors who refused to let their blood vanish into foreign soil. When they looked at Ezekiel, they saw echoes of those tales. Some believed a spirit traveled with him, perhaps one who died before its time, or one bonded to his family long before he could speak. Others believed the blue eye was a mark, a physical sign of a soul that had been fractured and reforged by tragedy. Many refused to say his name aloud after sunset, not out of fear of him, but out of respect for whatever force accompanied him. And it was this reverence, these whispered connections to past worlds, that turned him from a frightened boy into a figure carved into the memory of every community that crossed his path. Among the masters and overseers, however, the legend spread with a different. Their fear sharpened the stories into warnings. Men who prided themselves on owning other human beings looked upon Ezekiel with the same terror they reserved for dark omens, ill fortune, and signs of divine punishment. No one ever admitted aloud that a single boy frightened them, but their actions betrayed them. They refused to meet his gaze. They refused to be alone in a room with him. They sold him quickly and quietly, sometimes at a loss so steep their neighbors mocked them, until those neighbors bought the boy and understood for themselves why the sale was so desperate. And with each transfer the myth grew heavy. One rumor said he could see the exact moment someone would die just by looking at them. Another claimed that those who mistreated him suffered nightmares so vivid they woke screaming, clawing at their own skin. Still others insisted the boy could hear voices no one else heard, voices that warned him of cruelty, danger, or death. Masters who never met him still kept their distance, refusing to bid when they heard his name at auction. Overseers from different states exchanged crude jokes about him, trying to laugh away their unease, but even their laughter carried the edge of something brittle. The twisting, spreading fear did more than just haunt those who owned him. It changed the way entire communities operate. Some plantations warned traders not to bring the boy near their land. Others set rules: no children with unusual markings, no slaves with mismatched eyes, no workers who spoke too quietly or stared too long into the distance. These rules, built from superstition, were meant to shield them from the unknown, but instead they revealed their panic. A society built on power cannot tolerate even the hint of something it cannot control. Ezekiel represented that loss of control, and so the legend hardened. As his reputation expanded, so did the interpretations around it. To some enslaved workers, Ezekiel became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the strongest masters could feel fear, that even the most oppressive system had cracks in its foundation. Mothers whispered his story to their children at night, not to frighten them, but to remind them that the world was stranger, wider, and more mysterious than the plantation fences suggested. Some said that when he left a place, the land felt lighter afterward, as though he had drawn darkness away with him. Others insisted that he left more questions than answers, but questions were powerful too. Questions made people think. Questions made people doubt. Doubt alone could be a spark. In the eyes of enslaved men who longed for rebellion but were forced into silence, his legend became metaphor. He became the shadow that reminded them that even the smallest force could unsettle the mighty. Some began to speak of him in the same breath as other mysterious symbols of resistance: unnamed heroes, vanished runaways, spirits who punished cruel overseers. Ezekiel's blue eye became proof that not all battles were fought with weapons. Some were fought with fear, with unpredictability, with the quiet persistence of a presence that refused to be understood or contained. Meanwhile, the masters twisted the story into something darker, something that excused their own panic. They blamed him for bad harvests, for sudden storms, for inexplicable illnesses. They spoke of him as if he were not human, stripping him of his identity so they could justify their fear behind the guise of superstition. In their telling, he became almost monstrous, a reminder that the world might punish those who believed themselves untouchable. Men who had never questioned their authority suddenly felt vulnerable. Men who believed they controlled everything around them were forced to confront the idea that some things, some children, carried forces beyond their reach. This tension, this division in how the myth was interpreted, fueled its spread even further. Every new plantation added a chapter, every master added a fear, every enslaved community added a layer of meaning. The legend no longer depended solely on Ezekiel's presence. It lived independently now, feeding on the South's unease, embedding itself into the region's whispered folklore. Even after he was moved, even after the 7-day cycle repeated again and again, his shadow lingered. Workers spoke of him long after he left, as though his spirit remained with them. Overseers checked their doors twice at night, remembering stories told by others. And through it all, Ezekiel walked from place to place, silent, alone, carrying a reputation heavier than his thin shoulders should have been able to bear. Yet he never tried to change the stories. He never confirmed or denied them. He simply moved through each plantation like a quiet storm, leaving behind land that seemed to exhale when he departed and people who struggled to explain what they had felt. In this way he became more than a child. He became a living myth, a presence neither fully understood nor fully forgot. And as his legend passed through the South, carried by voices that bent but never broke its core, he transformed into something larger than fear itself. A reminder that even in the darkest systems, shadows could move in ways no chains could control. By the time Ezekiel vanished from the record, some claimed he had finally reached a place where the 7-day curse broke. Others whispered that he walked straight into the woods one night and kept walking until the trees swallowed him whole. A few swore he didn't disappear at all, that he simply stopped being seen by those who didn't deserve to see him. What remained were the stories. Stories of a boy with one blue eye who made the strongest masters tremble. Stories of a presence that exposed cruelty, unsettled evil, and reminded an entire world built on domination, that fear could strike in any direction, even upward. Stories that refused to die even when generations passed. And in the deepest corners of the South, old voices still say that if the air grows cold on a summer night, if animals go silent without reason, or if a single icy blue glimmer appears in the dark just long enough to make your heart stop, it means the boy has returned, not for vengeance, not for justice, but to make sure the world never forgets that no power, no brutality, no master, no empire can ever silence the kind of mystery that walks with a soul like his.